once again, I'm delighted to see so many of you sticking with it. This is our 5th time. We got tonight, and we got our next meeting, and that'll be the end of the Old Testament. You'll recall that we said earlier in the course that there were 3 major divisions to the Old Testament. First, you have the historical books. Then the second major division is the wisdom literature. And then our third major division was prophetic books. In fact, if you would have that handout with you, which was an outline of the Old Testament, you may want to dig that out. But I'll summarize it for the rest of us. For the historical books, we said that there were 5 subdivisions. You have the Pentateuch, a Greek word meaning 5 scrolls. That's equivalent to what the Jews call the Torah. The Deuteronomistic history, whereas the Pentateuch took us from Adam and creation down to Moses around 1250 BC. The Deuteronomistic history takes us from immediately after Moses, Joshua, down through the Babylonian exile in 587. The last event recorded in that 6-volume history, Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. After this comes another history. We don't know the name of its author, so we call it the Chronicler's history because it includes 1st and 2nd Chronicles and also Ezra and Nehemiah. That history, instead of starting where the previous one left off, goes all the way back to the beginning, to Adam, and quickly tells everything that happened, and then brings the history on down from the Babylonian exile around 587 down to the time of its author, which is around 400. Then we have 3 short stories, Tobit, Judith, and Esther, each of which is about the length of a typical short story nowadays. It would be 5 or 8 pages in the New Yorker or some magazine like that. And finally we have the Maccabean history. This consists of 2 books. They're unrelated. They're by different authors, but they're called 1st Maccabees and 2nd Maccabees. And they tell the events of the Maccabean revolt, which occurred around 167, and which resulted in independence for the Israelites in 165. Israel remained independent for 100 years, till 63 BC when the Romans took over, and that gets us ready for the New Testament period. Now that's the historical books. And if you look at the handout I gave you, that comprises the bulk of the Old Testament. How many books do we have there? We've got 5 in the Pentateuch. We have the 6 volumes of the Deuteronomistic history. I'm getting a little bit of a reverberation echo, aren't I? If that could be toned down just a touch.
You have something on your belt that...
On my belt?
Yeah. Is it on your belt? You have a buckle on your belt?
I'm not taking it off. This? Oh. Did that do it? Oh, you're smarter. Okay. 5 books in the Pentateuch. We've got... No, we still have it. Might just be the volume.
Yeah.
Or this might need to go a little lower. That might help. How's that? We got rid of the reverb? But now I'm not amplifying it. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's just go. Yeah, we got rid of the reverb.
Yes. Can they hear you now?
Everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll do all right.
Just very well now.
Good. Deuteronomistic history had 6 volumes originally. Joshua, Judges, 1st Samuel, 2nd Samuel, 1st Kings, 2nd Kings. But then we added Ruth in there as an appendix to the book of Judges because it's a short story which took place 2 books. Okay, math wizards, what did they give me? 23? 23? Okay. 21? 12 and 4, 16, 19, 21, right? Yeah. There we go. And how many books are there total in the Old Testament? Trick question, depends on whose Old Testament, right? In a Protestant Old Testament. 30, 39, good. In a Catholic Old Testament? 46. We have 7 extra books, more than the Protestant. So, if there's 46 total and we got 21 in the historical, that leaves us 25. So, a third at least, almost a half of the Old Testament is comprised by these historical books. That's why, in addition to having to do some background work, concepts of inspiration, that kind of thing, it took us 4 out of our 6 sections to get through the historical books. Tonight, though, I want us to turn our attention to that middle set of books, and next week, or
29,
we will finish off with the third major section, which will be the prophetic books. The second section is entitled Wisdom Literature. And you'll notice on the handout from a couple of sessions ago, there's no subdivisions here. We've only got 7 books, so why bother subdividing? They consist of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Koheleth, Song of Songs, the Book of Wisdom, and Sirach. As I pointed out when we went through the outline of the Old Testament, some of these books have alternate names. Koheleth used to be called, more frequently than nowadays, the Book of Ecclesiastes. And similarly, Sirach used to be called the Book of Ecclesiasticus. Because those 2 names are so similar, a certain amount of confusion resulted. Consequently, in the last 100 years or so, it has become the case that scholars prefer to use very distinct names. For the Book of Ecclesiastes, we now use the name Koheleth. For the Book of Ecclesiasticus, we now use the name Sirach. In addition to that, there are alternate names for the 2 intervening books also. Song of Songs is sometimes called Song of Solomon because it says that it was written by Solomon. You probably have heard it under that name, Song of Solomon. Sometimes you'll still see, not so much nowadays, use of the Latin-derived word canticles, or canticle of canticles. Canticle is just from the Latin word for song, so it really means the same thing. But those are alternate names for the very same book, Song of Songs. By the way, while we're talking about that particular title, let me mention something about the form of it. What you have here is a singular song, then the word of, and then a plural of the same noun, songs. So the basic pattern is X of X's. Can you think of another phrase like that?
Lord of Lords,
Lord of Lords,
King of Kings,
King of Kings. we have here is an idiom in Hebrew. This is the way that Hebrew says the superlative. Just to refresh your English grammar days back in high school, an adjective, like the word pretty, is said to have three forms. There's the simple form, pretty. There's the comparative form, prettier. You add er on the end of it. And there's the superlative form, where you add est to the end. Prettiest. Pretty, prettier, prettiest. The simple one, the comparative one, more so than some other, and the most possible, prettiest. Well, in Hebrew, the way to do the superlative is to use this pattern, X of X's. So when we say that Jesus is Lord of Lords, we mean He is the Lordest of all possible Lords. Similarly, if we say Song of Songs, we mean the songest of all songs that there is. That's where this title derives from. At any rate, there are these alternate titles for it: Song of Solomon, Canticles, or Canticle of Canticles. The Book of Wisdom, also you'll see under different titles occasionally. Since it also says that it was written by Solomon, you'll sometimes see it called Wisdom of Solomon. Sometimes they'll just refer to it without anything but the word wisdom. That's a little ambiguous because it's difficult to tell whether you're talking about wisdom itself, the act of being wise, or the state of being wise. Perhaps God's state of being wise, since you capitalized it, or whether you're referring to a specific book, namely the one that we call Book of Wisdom. But anyway, these are the basic titles of the books in the wisdom literature section of the Old Testament. We call this section wisdom literature. That phrase consists of two words, an adjective and a noun. Let's consider what those two words mean. If this were not an evening where we were discussing the Old Testament, if I just was walking down the street and I approached you and I stopped you and I said, "What is literature?" What would you say? What would pop into your head? You might think of some specific works of literature, right? Moby Dick, something like that. You might think of a literature class that you had in college or high school where you read Shakespeare and so on. That's what we normally think of as literature. Theoretically, you can use the word literature, and sometimes it is used this way, to mean anything that's written. Because ultimately it comes from the Latin word for letter, littera. That's where we get the word letter of the alphabet. So anything that's composed of alphabetical letters can be called literature. My grocery list to pick up on the way home can be called literature. That's why if you go into a travel agency and you're interested in the Caribbean, you can say, "Do you have any literature on Caribbean?" You say literature. What you mean is a brochure of some kind. That's not really a great work of art. It just means something written down. So it has that broad sense of literature. However, when used in this phrase, we do mean great literature. We mean literature in the sense in which that word is used in a literature class in high school or in college. So what sorts of works get read in literature? I already mentioned Moby Dick. What kind of work is that? Is that a brochure? It's a novel. One thing that's included in literature is a novel. I mentioned Shakespeare. What did he write? What else would qualify as literature? Poems, sure. Poetry. Short stories. Yeah, actually, you read short stories in literature classes. Essays. In fact, I was an English major at one point in my life, and when we studied British literature, I remember reading the essays of Charles Lamb. I remember reading the essays of William Hazlitt, Samuel Coleridge, etc. These were not read because of the information they conveyed, but because they were so well written. They were considered works of art in themselves. So yeah, essays also are a type of literature. Now those are the genres of literature that we normally think of. That word genre is a French word. In fact, it's the French word for genus. So it simply means category. For some reason we use that word when we're talking about literature, literary genres. But it just means type or category. So these are the 5 genres which are typically thought of by people in modern times when we want to think about literature in the sense of artistic writing. How well does this description fit the contents of this middle section of the Old Testament? Well, let's take a look. Right away, you think of Psalms. What do Psalms consist of? Psalms. If you open up the book of Psalms, is it in prose? No, it's in verse, right? These are poems. Not to say they're only poems, they're also prayers, but they are at least poems. So, Psalms can legitimately be included here because it fits within one of these genres. How about Proverbs? If you open up the book of Proverbs, is that in verse? Yeah, actually, most of the book of Proverbs consists of 2-line sayings, a proverbial saying, which typically in Hebrew takes 2 lines. So yeah, that'll fit. Song of Songs, it's a song, right? It's going to be lyrical, rhyming, all that sort of thing. Sure, that'll fit. What happened to short stories? We already had short stories, right? We got 3 short stories over here. Tobit, Judith, and Esther. Plus you could argue that the appendix to Judges, the book of Ruth, is a short story. It's only 4 chapters, beautifully written. Very similar in style and plot line and characterization to these 3. You can also argue that there's even a short story over in the prophetic books, and that's the book of Jonah. Most of the books in the prophetic section of the Old Testament are collections of prophecies, oracles, that prophets received. The book of Jonah isn't like that. It's a narrative about one of the prophets, a guy named Jonah. So it's a story, which happens to have Jonah as its main character. So actually, a person could make a good case for saying that these 5 books, the 3 short stories here, Tobit, Judith, Esther, plus Ruth, plus Jonah, ought to have been gathered out of those other 2 sections and put within the wisdom literature section. And I agree, that would make sense. So why didn't they wind up there? Chronological reasons, exactly. Remember when we were talking about these 3 major sections? We pointed out that the historical books are all past tense. The wisdom literature tends to be present tense, and the prophetic books tend to be future tense. Past, present, and future in their orientation. Consequently, perhaps it was the case that these were thought to be historical narratives rather than fictional back at the time that they were placed here. I don't know about that. But at least as far as tense goes, it makes sense to put them over there. Maybe that's why. At any rate, we do have these short stories in the Old Testament, but they did not wind up within the wisdom literature section of the Old Testament. So there aren't any short stories here. What else have we got? Well, how about Kohelet? Kohelet is probably not a book you're terribly familiar with, but it is a collection of essays. Kohelet is philosophical musings by an ancient Jewish sage, wise person, reflecting upon the big questions of life. You know, why is there evil? What about death? The sorts of things that you typically reflect on in your deepest moments. Consequently, Kohelet deserves to be here because it's a collection of essays, and it's very well written, I might add. Book of Wisdom, similarly, is a collection of essays. This, too, is a book of reflections upon the major issues of life. Relationship with God, those sorts of things. So that's justifiable. And Sirach is justifiable for two reasons. Number one, it's a collection of essays. He'll talk about the nature of friendship for half a page. Then he'll talk about the nature of marriage for half a page. He'll spend half a page on what's the best kind of doctor to pick. I kid you not, that's in there. He'll spend another half a page talking about controlling your speech, the importance of doing that. This essay-like compositions, they're not just little two-line proverbs or something. They're more expanded than that. But they're also in verse, unlike the essays in Kohelet and Wisdom, which are in prose. So Sirach can be justified for inclusion in the wisdom literature, both because it's poetry and because it's essays. So pick your pick. Either way, it's qualified to be here. Well, that's every single one of the books in the wisdom literature except for the first one, Job. I saved that one for last because it is the most peculiar book here. Job is the only play in the Old Testament. The book of Job is a play. I will justify that designation later this evening because we're going to take a look at Job. And we're going, after these introductory general comments, we're going to want to look at a text, and the one that I'd like us to look at this evening is going to be Job. And there you'll see that it has basically the structure of a play, for the most part. No other book in the Old Testament, or New for that matter, has a play-like structure in this same way. So there we have all of the books here. We can see why we give this section the designation literature. It does have a very high literary quality to it. I'll point out also that in addition to there being no short stories in this section, although there are in the Old Testament, similarly, there are no novels in the wisdom literature section of the Old Testament. Are there novels in the historical books or in the prophetic books? Not in the prophetic books, that's for sure. What about the historical books? That's kind of difficult. Depends on what you mean by a novel, right? How long does something have to be before it ceases being a short story and becomes a novel? Because the last third of the book of Genesis is one big long story about Joseph and everything that happened to him. And if it's all written by one guy at some point, it all has the same style throughout, the same way of thinking, speaking, and so on. And that goes from chapters 35 to 50. That's 15 chapters. That's fairly long for one continuous story. Similarly, the narratives about David, once he had become king, are found in the second half of 2 Samuel and the beginning of 1 Kings, and that's one continuous narrative. So that goes from Samuel 9 to 20. That would be 12 chapters, plus the first few chapters of Kings. That's about 15 chapters also. So I don't know if those qualify. How about novellas, maybe? Isn't that a term we use for short novels? kind of in between the short story and the long. So there are embedded within the historical parts of the Old Testament some extended narratives which may or may not qualify as novels. I don't know. Anyway, this explains the use of the term literature here. Literature, however, is only the noun. We've also got an adjective. And that adjective is wisdom. Let's try it again. Suppose that instead of being here talking about the Old Testament, I'm some guy you never saw before who approaches you on the sidewalk and says, "What is wisdom?" What will come to your mind? What would you think of? Besides the fact that I'm a nut. Right. That would be a wise conclusion. Knowledge. Wisdom is some kind of knowledge, right? I think that's true. Yeah, that's a good point, too. Not just any knowledge, but it has to be useful in some way, right? The ability to use it. I suppose that one of the publications of the IRS to help you fill out your tax form gives you knowledge, right? I wonder why that came to mind. Well, I don't know. It certainly gave me knowledge, but I don't consider myself a wiser person for having slogged my way through that stuff. So, not everything qualifies as wisdom. It's a special type of knowledge, right?
Experience.
Yeah, it's got to have to do something with experience, right? Yes, it has to be truly absorbed and not just book learning, right? You could sit down and read a textbook on biology and you wouldn't necessarily want to wise. So yeah, it's got to have something to do with experience. It's got to be something that is truly learned and able to apply it. Yeah, it's going to have to do this practical idea, that is practical knowledge, not just theoretical stuff. How do we want to word this? Well, I suppose we could add practical here. Practical knowledge gained from experience. I'm sorry, inner what?
Recognition. I think that when we recognize when we really learn something, I think that's one.
Yes, I agree with that. It's one thing to hear somebody talk about what marriage is going to be like in a home economics class or a theology class in high school. It's a whole different thing when you get married and you experience it for yourself. Then what you were told wasn't untrue, but you know it in a much deeper understanding way. Yeah.
I can't remember, and it might be in the Bible where it says, the beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord.
Wow, good for you.
And they always talk about wisdom as she, I think.
That's true too.
Which
Yeah.
I always wondered about that.
And I wonder if they don't refer to wisdom as she because wisdom is so highly thought of that in some parts of the wisdom literature, and of course this is God's wisdom that we're talking about here, God's wisdom is treated as if it were an entity alongside of God. For example, here's the book of Proverbs chapter 8. Here's a poem where wisdom is actually speaking. Well, it's a little introduction to her speaking. Proverbs chapter 8, verse 1. Does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice? On the heights beside the way, at the crossroads, she takes her stand. Beside the gates in front of the town, at the entrance of the portals, she cries out. To you, O people, I call, and my cry is to all that live. O simple ones, learn prudence, etc., etc. So yeah, she is depicted as female. And later in this chapter, she continues speaking, we hear her say this: "The Lord created me at the beginning of his work. Ages ago I was set up, at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. When he assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters might not transgress his command. When he marked out the foundations of the earth, then was I beside him, like a master worker, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and delighting in the human race." Well, this is God's wisdom being talked about. It's not our wisdom, because humans don't even exist yet when this entity existed, right? I existed before the earth was made, and so on. So this is God's wisdom being talked about. But God's wisdom is not being thought of as a characteristic of God, but is actually being personified, as if she were an entity alongside God, or in front of God, in between God and the creation, as God is bringing everything into existence. When he marked out the foundations of the earth, then was I beside him like a master worker. I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, and delighting in the human race. You get this kind of playful female figure involved at creation. So, perhaps wisdom is personified as female because God is always thought of as male. And if you're going to have a personification of a figure alongside God, you tend to think of female because you've already got the male. That's one possibility. An even simpler explanation is the fact that in Hebrew, the word wisdom is chokhmah. And in Hebrew, just like French, just like Spanish, you got male and female nouns. Or just like German, they even have neuter, der, die, and das. So it happens that chokhmah is a female noun. I have no idea how that happened. Nobody does. But maybe just because the word is female, they wound up, when they personified God's wisdom, they thought of it as being female. Who knows? Anyway, we're after a description of wisdom. So far we've got practical knowledge that is gained from experience, and your point about
The beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord.
fear of the Lord. Isn't it true that we tend to think of wisdom having to do with ethical and religious stuff rather than a biology textbook or something like that? It has to do with this kind of morality aspect of life and religion. So how about if we add, we've got practical knowledge gained from wisdom concerning morality and religion.
In the book of Job, and I highlight the verse 1 to page 6, and it was ago, but when I look at the book of Job, it's telling there that wisdom is the fear of God. There's a promise.
That's similar to the verse that she was thinking of. You sometimes find this phrase in the Old Testament, fear of the Lord. And that can be troublesome to people. You know, I don't want to have to fear God. I thought I was supposed to love him. You know, how can I love him if I'm afraid of him? And that sort of thing. Well, I'm not sure that the two are exclusive, for one thing. I feared my dad, but I also loved him. And I'm not sure but what there isn't an aspect of God that we ought to fear, because after all, he is all-powerful, holding billions of stars in existence at this moment, and therefore someone not to take for granted. Still, that word, and I can't remember the Hebrew word for fear at the moment, but the word in Hebrew that's translated fear in most of our translations perhaps ought to be translated awe. Because in Hebrew the word it does include a certain amount of face of God. And I think that's a very wise saying. I think wisdom begins with recognition of the immensity and mysteriousness of God. How greatly God extends beyond our human imaginings. So when you see that phrase, fear of the Lord, don't just think of being afraid. In fact, that's the least part of it. The main part of it is a sense of how awesome God is. That's where wisdom gets its beginning. I think you're thinking of Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7 that says that. Anyway, how about this for a definition? Practical knowledge gained from experience concerning morality and religion. I think that's pretty decent. At least, if you said that when I came up here on the sidewalk, I would let you go on and walk. I would be satisfied. Yes?
As I listen to you, I'm thinking the gifts of the Spirit. I wonder if it is possible that wisdom includes all the other gifts. Translating all the information of all.
Well, that's an interesting question. Those gifts of the Holy Spirit are found in the Bible in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 2 and 3. It's describing what the Messiah is going to be like, and it's describing the Spirit that has come upon the Messiah. But of course, now that we're in the Messianic age, and Jesus has given us the Spirit, these are gifts that we also receive. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord, and his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. So there you got these 7 items delineated, one of which is wisdom. I don't know. When you look at them here in the Bible, they don't seem that distinct. You got wisdom, understanding, knowledge. Those all seem somewhat similar to me. Over time, over the past 2,000 years, as theologians have reflected upon these 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit that are mentioned in Isaiah 11:2, they have made subtle distinctions between them, but I can't recall what they are right offhand. So, but I suppose it would ultimately be a matter of definition. Insofar as wisdom is one of the items correlative with the other 6, as listed here, it seems to be something distinct from, at least have a different emphasis from the others. And yet, the beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord. So I can see a reasonable from what you're suggesting. Maybe the word wisdom can be used either narrowly or broadly. Maybe that's what's going on. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just making an observation based on the fear of the Lord. Talking about understanding.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Just going down the line. I understand this number 1 gift. And all it is.
Yeah. I was just debating in my mind whether I would want to say wisdom is the number 1 rather than fear of the Lord is the number 1. But actually I think I would, because after all, the verse says, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That means wisdom is a larger outgrowth of fear of the Lord. So even if fear of the Lord has a certain logical or chronological priority, wisdom is the larger category, we can see, at least as used in that verse. Well, anyway, this definition that you people have come up with may or may not be the best possible, but I'm certainly satisfied with it. And it is what we normally think of when we think of wisdom, right? Something like this. How well does this description fit these 7 books? Practical knowledge gained from experience concerning morality and religion. Well, hey, nobody is going to deny that definition fits Proverbs. knowledge gained by experience of generations of Israelites. This experience was condensed into little nuggets, little 2-line, 1-sentence statements. And they are very wise. I just flipped to it. It says, "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring." That's wise. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it, and a stone will come back on one who starts it rolling. Good point. Good observation. A lying tongue hates its victims, and a flattering mouth works ruin. If you don't believe that, watch General Hospital for a while. You'll see that all over the place. A lying tongue works ruin, etc. These are wise sayings, right? They're wonderful. Just sit down some evening and read through these. They're just very full of wisdom. So unquestionably, this will fit with Kohelet, we already said, is philosophical musings on religion and morality type questions. Certainly, he drew on his experience. Sirach, similarly, full of all kinds of practical advice, even how to pick a doctor, as I mentioned. So that's practical knowledge gained from experience concerning morality and religion. The Book of Wisdom, true to its name, deals with wisdom throughout the book. An investigation of the primary type things to know in order to be a wise person. Now that leaves us with Job, Psalms, and Song of Songs. I think we can justify inclusion of these 3 books under the category of wisdom, but not as obviously or not as immediately as the other books. Job we can include, although it does not cover all hundreds of aspects of life, like a lying tongue or dig a pit and you'll fall in it, those kinds of things. It only deals with one problem, and one problem only. And that's the problem of evil. Why is there evil? I think that the conclusions it comes up with concerning that problem is very wise. So ultimately, it is a wise book, and it will teach you wisdom if you read it. But it's not wide open wisdom, all aspects of morality and religion, such as you would find in some of the other books. Now, these last 2, Psalms and Song of Songs, are the most difficult to refer to as wisdom. Psalms you can probably slip in under wisdom, even though it almost never refers to wisdom, and even though it does not give you practical advice for daily living, the way Proverbs does and that kind of thing. But it is prayers. And there's a lot of wisdom in having a prayerful attitude in life. And reading these 150 prayers, which have been selected over the centuries by the Israelites in Old Testament times, do educate your heart in how to have a relationship with God. And it doesn't just talk about it, it shows you. It lets you listen in to the ancient Israelites having their relationship with God. So I think we can justify including it under the description wisdom. Song of Songs is probably the hardest to justify. The Song of Songs is a set of lyrics for a wedding. That's the nature of the book of Song of Songs. I'm sure that originally it had music to it. Or whatever the ancient Hebrew equivalent of that was. Still, where are you going to put it? You can stick it with the prophetic books? No. You're going to stick it in history? No. You're going to put it in the middle section, right? Besides which, even here, in a very attenuated, most attenuated way, we can still argue that there's wisdom involved because we're talking about the relation between a man and a woman, between spouses in a marriage relationship. And that certainly involves morality and religion and practical knowledge gained from experience. So I think it fits least the description of wisdom, but nevertheless, even it can be justified. At any rate, these are the reasons why this middle section of the Bible has come to be known as wisdom literature. Well, that concludes my introductory comments. I would like for us to take a look at one of the books in the wisdom literature section, but it's about halfway through, so why don't we take a break now? And this is a natural juncture.